and welcome to today's webinar, Venezuela and Nicaragua, Successfully Defeating the Monroe Doctrine. This webinar is hosted by the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group with support from the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. I'll put the websites of both these organizations in the chat, and we encourage you to join us in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua. There will be time for questions, so please type any questions that you have into the Q&A section on your screen, and our panelists will address them later in the program. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to everyone who registered for the webinar. My name is Becca Renk. I am the moderator of today's webinar. I'm originally from the US, but have been living in Nicaragua in Ciudad Sandino for more than 20 years, and I'm part of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. Anyone who's been watching the mainstream news and social media on Venezuela has seen allegations of fraud in Venezuela's elections this past July 28th, with the US claiming that there is overwhelming evidence the opposition won. Today, however, you'll get to hear a very different story firsthand, one that shows how, despite 200 years of rampant US interventionism in Latin America, both Venezuela and Nicaragua can claim victory over the Monroe Doctrine. You'll hear how Venezuela celebrated verifiably clean elections on July 28th, resulting in a clear victory for Venezuela's incumbent president, Nicolás Maduro, with 51.2% of the vote, and far-right candidate Edmundo González losing with 44.2% of the vote. Our speakers today will talk about how, once it became clear that Maduro had won, a combined media and diplomatic coup was launched in coordination with organized crime and cyber attacks, replete with a massive disinformation campaign. We've seen footage of how far-right post-electoral violence has claimed the lives of members of the armed forces and injured many more, also resulting in violent attacks resulting in damage to schools, healthcare centers, food storage facilities, and media outlets, among other targets. You'll hear today how these attacks parallel the situation in Nicaragua in April of 2018, when protests began that were ostensibly against proposed reforms to the Social Security system. It quickly became obvious, however, that the protests were actually an attempt to overthrow the elected Nicaraguan government. Armed opposition groups set up hundreds of roadblocks which paralyzed the country for 3 months and became epicenters of violence, with some 270 people killed and many more injured. While opposition sources blamed the Nicaraguan government for violence, a study by the Truth Commission showed otherwise, and journalist investigations subsequently proved that the US government was funding the violence. Today, our 4 panelists will discuss and share their extensive knowledge and personal experiences in both Venezuela and Nicaragua to provide us with insight into the successful efforts of Nicaragua and Venezuela to defend their sovereignty. I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker today, Francisco Dominguez. Francisco is the head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University. He is the national secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign and co-author of the book, Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America. Francisco has just returned from Venezuela, where he was able to accompany the Venezuelan people in their elections and see the process firsthand. Francisco, can you tell us what you saw and experienced during the elections in Venezuela?
Sure, thank you for organizing this. It's quite timely. And the idea of making a comparison, a contrast between what happened to Nicaragua and Venezuela is very appropriate. I think, people will draw good conclusions out of this and we hope to do a good job. I was invited to be an observer. I think they call them veedores, which is somebody who is going to watch rather than observe. The reason why there is a difference between watching and observing is because observing is when there is a team that has been organized internationally for some reason that the elections in any particular country are not to be relied upon. So there is observation when there is this problem. The Venezuelan system is the best in the world. It's been characterized as that by none other than Jimmy Carter himself. And so therefore I was there. We arrived there on the 23rd. We did several meetings. They gave us information, inducted us as to what we were supposed to be doing, where we were going to be going, and so on. And it was totally peaceful. There was absolutely no problem on the 23rd, 24th, 25th, all the way to the 28th. On the 28th itself, the election took place without any major complication. We visited several, a group of us visited several centers. The amount of people that turned up was huge, but much more than normal. In fact, the information we have now from the National Electoral Council, the CNE in Spanish acronym, is in the region of 61, 62% compared to the election on 2018, where the turnout was 41 because the opposition boycotted the election, did not participate. So you can imagine you have a situation where there is no complication whatsoever, no problem at all. And the difficulty was that in the evening, there was a delay in the information being given to the population, to the public, to the voters. Normally, given that the system is totally computerized, the results are more or less in 2-3 hours after the polling stations close. In this case, it was taking longer and longer. I would say it possibly took something like 2 to 3 hours longer than normal. So we got the first information by 11:30 p.m. And the information was on the first bulletin from the CNE, where President Maduro has won by 52% against 44% of Edmundo Gonzalez, followed by various others. Almost immediately, literally 30 seconds after, we were watching television in various places. No sooner President Maduro announced that this was the case, no sooner the CNE announced the results, that 30 seconds later in a television network of the right wing, there was Maria Corina Machado who made the statement, not necessarily Edmundo Gonzalez, the extreme right wing candidate, who said that they have won, they have 100% of the documents signed for every single voting place, and that they are won by 70%, and Maduro had got only 30%. And they said they would not recognize the results. So that created a context. Immediately on that night, before any violence, I'm not aware there was any violence on the evening, there was a huge march going to the presidential palace by, the Chavista people, with thousands and thousands and thousands of them. We saw them walking by, going towards the presidential palace to celebrate, and we saw the images on television. We were extremely happy, very relaxed, and they were dancing, shouting, screaming, when you celebrate the thing. Now, next day, there was pandemonium. But before I get into the pandemonium, I want to give some context as to how and what was the context where this took place. First of all, number one, I think what we are facing in the case of Venezuela on this particular occasion is a coup d'etat of a new type. And this involved the following components. Number one, I was very surprised. In fact, I was shocked by the level of homogeneity of all, I don't want to exaggerate, all the corporate media in the world. I speak several languages. I checked so many newspapers to see whether there was anywhere in the world that was not part of the mainstream media, that was not telling the same story. This was a massive campaign of bombardment, a media campaign of bombardment, which was directed towards the people of Venezuela, which was extremely nasty. It was really nasty, it was really intense, it was really toxic, and it was 24/7. This lasted several months. Now, there is only one center in the world, as far as I'm aware, that has the ability and the power to really command that level of obedience by the whole of the international media. And I think that is in Washington. So this is a very important component. This was supplemented by a really nasty, I don't know how many, but millions of messages of hatred, very intense hatred being spewed through all sorts of mechanisms, through cell phones, social media, social networks, and so on, which was really bombarding the population literally all the time. And the key messages of the mainstream media was the following: the elections are rigged, Maduro is going to lose, but if he wins, then there is going to be a massive exodus of Venezuelans leaving the country, which is going to be much, much bigger than the one that left before. They even quoted polls, would you believe it? Quoted polls, which obviously are totally fake, that they reckon that 40% of the population would leave the country if President Maduro won. 40% of the population in Venezuela is about 12 to 13 million. This was insane, but you can imagine the pain that the population went through with the sanctions and with the exodus that did take place. They encouraged themselves. You know, imagine the shock, the impact, the pain, the anxiety that this produced in them. So that was the second part. All the period before the election, there were discrete but loads of information about terrorist attacks. Many of the terrorist attacks, particularly in the border with Colombia, but not exclusively, there were many terrorist attacks, particularly targeting the electric system. They targeted, food storage facilities. They also targeted several headquarters of the PSUV, the Socialist Party of Venezuela. And they attacked several other places, but mainly the main concentration was there. And only something like 2 days before election day, Freddy Bernal, who is the governor of the state of Táchira in the border with Colombia, showed on television the arrest of 6 individuals, 2 of them Colombian paramilitaries, 4 of them Venezuelans, who actually were intending to blow up a massive electricity facility in that state, which was going to live without electricity about between 4 to 5 states. And he showed the cylinders that they have, plus several other weaponry. And he calculated that the explosions of those cylinders, which was the intention, was equivalent to 750 kilograms of TNT. You can imagine the intention of that. So the whole basis of the whole preparation of this coup d'etat, was actually to ensure that the CNE digital system could not produce the results. Then there are plenty of information from the vice president, for the president, for several ministers, the president of the National Assembly, and a few others, members of the PSUV, saying that the CNE system, the digital system, electronic system, was subjected to massive cybernetic attack from North Macedonia. I was surprised at why Macedonia, but anyway, any other place where you cannot see the real hand behind it. And the whole idea of this, I don't have technological knowledge that good to be able to explain it better, but what it was is that the CNE system, the CNE digital system that calculates, totalizes the system as the information is coming in, has something like 15 firewalls. So the cybernetic attack intended to destroy one by one of these firewalls. So therefore, until they got to the end of it, to the core of it, which they intend to destroy. So what happened was technicians, these experts, of the CNE, were constantly trying to repair the firewall. And when you repair the firewall, it takes time, but also you have to reset the system. These were the reason for the delay. So I think to begin to draw some conclusions, I think the intention was to destroy the CNE system so that there was no results given whatsoever. In the absence of those results, given that they prepare these riots, these guarimbas, they call them in Venezuela, they intended to launch it, and this was part and parcel of the coup d'etat. The violence was terrible. I remember I was in one of the hotels, and suddenly our hotel was surrounded by about 400 thugs. And they came, you could see that they really wanted to do damage. I don't think they realized we were there. Otherwise, I think we'll be telling a different story. They surrounded the hotel but didn't intend to come in. They saw a couple of National Guard officers there who they attacked. They brutalized them horribly. We saw all of us from our windows. And then they took one of the motorbikes of one of the National Guard officers and they set it on fire right there and then. So when we began to get the information about what was going on in many other places, it was a complete national, in many cities they went for it. I cannot go into every detail, but they did damage to 12 universities. They tried to set on fire hospitals. They went for crashes with people and children inside. They attacked something like 3,600 members of the PSUV or people that they thought they were members of it. They went on the rampage, they attacked 30 ambulances, very reminiscent of what happened in Nicaragua. So because they couldn't do it, because they couldn't prevent the result from coming out, then the actual Warimba, the actual riot lost steam. I don't have all the details, but my sense is that the riots lasted for about 4 hours. They didn't last for more. The information we have is that about 60 to 70% of those who were arrested participating in the riots were very young. Many of them came from the United States and from Chile, people who had left Venezuela in the past. None of them voted. They were asked specifically after they were interrogated whether they voted. They said none of them voted. They were told they were paid something like between $40 to $150 to do this. And what is interesting of the whole thing is that in order for them to get paid, I understand, they have to take a selfie of themselves doing the damage. Otherwise, they don't get the money. And in order to ensure that they're enthusiastic enough, they were given, as they've done before in 2014 in the riots then that lasted 3 months, and in the riot in 2017 that lasted more or less 6 months as well, they were given a drug, which is normally used by mercenaries in order to focus their attention. This is the actual information. So what happened was they went on the rampage and they caused a lot of damage. Now, just to perhaps we can discuss this later on because I don't want to make it too long. But what happened was that President Maduro went to the Supreme Court to start with, and then requested that the Supreme Court investigated the whole electoral process. And the Supreme Court was receptive of this proposal, where President Maduro and the CNE promised, and they have done it already, going to submit 100% of the documentation of all the voting places. No sooner the Supreme Court accepted this investigation, and the Supreme Court called upon all the candidates to submit all the evidence that they had. No sooner this was accepted that 3 minutes later, Anthony Blinken actually declared his recognition of Edmundo Gonzalez as the elected president of Venezuela. That is to say, Blinken and the State Department, who were behind the coup d'etat, tried to stop this very smart initiative, which was legal, totally constitutional, by President Maduro. So now what we have is the United States in the last 2 days, suddenly, through a spokesperson from the White House, backtracked on the recognition. The guy, in a very convoluted statement, said more or less something like, well, we haven't got all the evidence, we haven't got all the information, and we're not in a position yet to extend or issue this recognition, which was followed, surprisingly, almost hours later, by Argentina. Argentina also backtracked. It had recognized Edmundo Gonzalez, and now it didn't. So there is still pending. Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, they said that they are going to engage in what they call a strategic pause of their action. The Attorney General of Venezuela is instigated a criminal investigation into their activity, which is subversion, usurpation of functions, declaring themselves winners, and so on. And what the Attorney General said, we're not going for arrest for now. That was made very, very, very clear. So the position is now that apparently Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia seems to be a sort of bridge between the United States and the Biden administration and the Venezuelan government. And I think the Venezuelan government, by having taken a very firm line not to make any concessions of any kind whatsoever because they won, and they won clean. This has really firmed up just about everybody else and has forced the United States to backtrack. So not only they scored a very important victory against the right wing, against the right wing again, but also they defeated a fascist coup d'etat who'd been terrible. So our responsibility, and I hope to be able to say more on this, our responsibility is to ensure that we redouble our solidarity with Venezuela, but also draw the conclusion if this could be done to Venezuela, there is no reason why these tools and weapons and powerful mechanisms that the United States has cannot be deployed and used ferociously against any other country. I leave there and wait for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. It's so important in knowing how to respond to questions, being able to say we've heard firsthand what is actually happening there. I'd like to remind people, if you have any questions for Francisco, you can put those in the Q&A section to be answered later. And now I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Camila Escalante. Camila is a correspondent for Press TV and a reporter on Latin America and the Caribbean. She's co-founder and editor of Kawsachun News, providing on-the-ground reporting from Latin America in English. Camila, you've just returned from Venezuela. You were able to see the electoral process and bear witness in the aftermath, and you've been able to interview many people. What have you seen, and what are the people of Venezuela saying about the situation there?
Hi, Becca and everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm now in Managua. I just returned from Caracas, where I attended. I wasn't Venezuela in my capacity as a reporter, always as a reporter. I'm not any kind of electoral or election expert. I think it's very important to say my role is always as a reporter. I attended just weeks or just 1 week before the election took place. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to spend a lot of time in the country ahead of the election to be able to visit the states. So all of my reporting in this instance, although I've been based in Venezuela before, but this time took place only in Caracas, in the capital. I was able to observe remotely some of the different campaign activities leading up to this final week. Ultimately, I attended the final closing rally of the PSUV, of the many parties, in fact, including the PSUV, which had as candidate President Nicolas Maduro on the ballot. The closing campaign rally took place on Avenida Libertador. And that was, although we've seen like a very concerted campaign against this electoral process and disinformation campaign internationally, that was one of the things in which I saw that that the news was just being disseminated in the most falsified ways possible. On that same day, which was the Thursday before the elections, there were closing rallies held by both the Chavistas and by the opposition, which was supporting their main opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina. But the images shown on social media and in the mainstream news internationally made it seem as if the closing rally for Maria Corina was much larger. In fact, it wasn't. I think it's really important to have people and alternative outlets on the ground to be able to attest to that, because the base of Maria Corina, represented in this election by Edmundo Gonzalez, mobilizes people in a very specific section or area of Caracas, which is Altamira, Las Mercedes, Chacao, and the eastern part of the city on Avenida Francisco Miranda. And all of the people that you see in those images on social media is everyone who is there. Whereas in the case of the Chavista mobilizations, they're able to bring in people from all around the city, even sometimes all around the country. And in this case, there is a main march on Avenida Libertador, where the stage is, and then there are satellite marches. There are satellite rallies in different parts. There are 4 additional jumbotrons of people watching. Otherwise, they would be kilometers and kilometers away. I don't think that any of the mainstream media is showing the way in which there are just so many more people who mobilize in reality, not virtually, for Maduro. The scale just doesn't even compare. I don't know why and how it is that people are able to get away with showing images as if these are similar mobilizations. That was one thing. But Chavistas have also told me and reporters that they were really impressed about the extent to which Chavismo was able to mobilize in a way that we haven't seen necessarily on this scale during Maduro's time in office, particularly because, for some, he wasn't as beloved as Chavez, also because of COVID, and also because of the magnicide attempt that took place in August of 2018, which I think as a result of that, President Maduro had to take a number of precautionary measures and may not have been in public or without protection as much as he would like to be for some period. So this election campaign had a really significant turnout. I spoke to people, I interviewed people, not only at rallies, but also just out in public, asking them why they support, in this case, President Maduro. They said that they would never support any candidate that went to Washington asking for sanctions, asking for more hardship on the Venezuelan people. They recognize that Maria Corina is a media personality and celebrity and multimillionaire in Miami, in a different country. A lot of the personalities of the opposition have not only gone to wish death and suffering upon their people to Washington and Europe and all the European capitals and Bogota, and they've been living abroad, but they're also doing quite well on the exterior. They haven't bothered being in their country throughout this time. And a lot of their family and their children live in the United States or abroad. And they're, they simply want a different model and a different life. And this is the reason why, a lot of people who may not feel as strongly as they may have before in this election, one way or another, had told me that they would not, under any circumstances, be supporting an opposition who is going out and asking for additional sanctions. People do recognize that it's the unilateral coercive measures that have been so impactful on the economy of Venezuela, on the homes and families of people, and that is why we saw the shortages and the different economic problems we saw in recent years, which now, of course, the economy is in a much better place. I'm going to try to zoom through everything because I know we have a lot to cover. I want to just discuss some of the violence that I saw firsthand. On election night, I was at the Miraflores Palace, and I was there with the March of Chavistas and all the people who came to celebrate the victory of President Nicolas Maduro. And we heard him speak, and then we had to leave, and I had to await a bus thereby. The security had removed us from the premises following that big celebration. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was standing by an apartment block with some other people waiting for a bus. And from that moment at 2 o'clock in the morning following the elections and the announcement by the CNE, we had glass bottles thrown at us down. We were on the ground, but from an apartment block of people of the opposition who recognized that there were people walking around in Chavista shirts, walking around with their different flags of their political parties. And so they were throwing glass bottles for something like an hour while I was standing there, including when I was doing a live report. And, obviously they would have to have quite good aim to hit somebody, but actually in 2017, I know someone whose family member was killed by a glass bottle in that same way. There were also instances of the guarimbas holding those what we call tranques in Nicaragua, or bloqueos in other countries, but it's really just roadblocks where they're burning tires, where they're burning branches and all sorts of other things, also throwing rocks at cars that are trying to pass. And they were able to successfully block some people who were trying to exit the country and go to the airport at that time. Although I'm not sure, what Francisco is referring to as riots, but in terms of like the violence and terrorism we saw, it did occur over a period of about 48 hours in different parts of the country, whether it be, a small gathering of people, like 8 people, 20 people, or something much larger. That included acts of arson and all sorts of other crimes against things, including a community radio station, which again, we heard of here in Nicaragua. It included other public infrastructure. And of course, this is nothing new: schools, hospitals, health clinics, and more. Let me see what else. There were, we saw a couple of significant two opposition rallies since the election, but that is the extent to which they have been able to mobilize is 2 times. On the Tuesday following the election and on Saturday. In the case of Chavismo, they have been holding near daily mobilizations in defense of the vote, in defense of their sovereign process and their elected government and president. That has been every day, I think, except for Sunday. They have been marching to the Miraflores Palace, sometimes from the different neighborhoods, sometimes from meeting in different places of the popular neighborhoods of Candelaria, of 23 de Enero, of Katia, and the other points where they normally set out. And we have seen marches of women, of youth, of workers, which is a combination of state workers and unions, and other people organized by sector. We've seen marches of all sorts of people throughout these days, including yesterday. I guess one of the things that the government has warned of now is of course the use of violence that we've seen in years before. The guarimbas, the terrorism. In recent years, we saw, well, first and foremost, they have talked about the cyber attacks on the transmission and totalization system during that very sensitive phase. We have in the past seen attacks on the electrical system, on oil refineries. These are the sorts of things that a political movement without any real base and without any sophisticated organization has to resort to. They have no other recourse but to pay people to commit these acts of terrorism, to try to wage war on the morale of the people who have committed to staying in the country and waiting out all the hardship that took place, particularly in 2016 to 2019. They had to withstand all of these different attacks, and the opposition has made a concerted effort to make it more difficult to live in the country. Things are booming, things are back to normal. There's a lot of foreign investment, a lot of stores are open once again, nightclubs, young people are able to go out and use a ride app and go to a bar for very low cost. There's safety in the streets, people are taking their cell phones out, and it's at that time now that you know, people's lives are coming under attack once again. Obviously, it was on some level a great feat of Chavismo that the Civic Military Police Alliance was able to come out and retake the streets of the different capitals of the different states in the country, and particularly of Caracas. And in that show of force, I think it was very important for the morale of people just sitting at home, seeing that they're not going to allow, that neither Chavismo nor the government is going to allow for these acts of violence to continue. So people have been arrested. As of last night, President Maduro said that 2,200 people have actually been arrested for the different crimes around the country. As I said, things like, carrying pistols, assaulting people, acts of arson, and everything else that's been mentioned by Francisco. And as he said, the profile of the people that have been committing these crimes is people who have been paid, people who have committed crimes in the past. They have a criminal record. They received directives to commit these crimes. They were often the influence of drugs. And some of them are, of course, adolescents once again. And just to recall some of the acts of violence that we've seen by the same opposition in the past, they have perpetrated and planned false flags in the past. In 2002, they killed their own people to the tune of 19 people were killed by snipers, and something like 120 people were injured. We saw false flags in 2014 and 2017. We saw staged protest with the participation of mainstream media. And we know that we also saw the false flag, which was the Cucuta incident, in which they purported to bring in humanitarian aid. There was really no aid there. Like I said, the apagones, the power outages in 2019, 2020, and all of these other incidents, the mercenary incursion in 2020, I believe, in which they actually paid mercenaries to come to the country, foreign mercenaries, Colombians and US citizens who were trained in paramilitary camps to come carry out a magnicide attempt in Venezuela once again. And so, this is the sort of thing we're looking at. On the one hand, there is some sort of, to some extent, we can celebrate that those, what I'm calling 48 hours of instability, has come to an end, and that there have been arrests and that people will be prosecuted. But at the same time, we know that when they have no other recourse and they have no real base, that there's a potential that we're going to see more violence. We have to remember that the US is no longer, in recent years, working directly on the ground. They're not carrying out foreign invasions and military attacks and using drones and bombings and things like that. They're using proxies, and they're outsourcing their wars usually to private military companies or through NGOs and through subcontracted armed groups. And that's what we're seeing right now. And so they do have other ways of perpetrating violence in our countries, and the guarimbas is just one of many. So I'll stop there, and then I'll come back for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Camila. It's so good to have that all brought into perspective with the sort of the modern day usage of the Monroe Doctrine, and really what the Venezuelan country is facing and the people of Venezuela are facing. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to John Perry in Nicaragua. Originally from the UK, John has lived in Masaya, Nicaragua for more than 20 years. He writes about politics and social issues in Central America for the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, FAIR, Covert Action Magazine, the London Review of Books, and elsewhere. John, in 2018, you bore witness as Masaya became the center of some of the worst violence from the opposition's roadblocks of death, which were organized and financed by the US. Since then, you've done a lot of writing on fairness and reporting with regards to Nicaragua. What parallels do you see between Nicaragua and Venezuela in the false narratives created to promote violence and destabilize the elected governments of these countries?
Thanks, Becca. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope that that works for everybody. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, when I saw the images from Caracas and the rest of Venezuela late on the 28th of July and on the 29th, I was struck by the similarities between what was happening there and what happened in Nicaragua in 2018. And in Masaya, we suffered particularly from the violence during the coup attempt in 2018. So I'm just going to briefly draw some comparisons between the two. I know there are a lot of differences, and I'm just going to focus on the similarities. And some of the differences I think have already been brought out in what Francisco and Camila have been saying. But many of the tactics were the same. Peaceful marches quickly led to violence. They were orchestrated by opposition groups that are financed by the US. When police are killed, or bystanders are killed, or government supporters are killed, the protests, these killings are blamed on the government. There's a whole range of violence taking place, burning of public buildings, burning of media offices, threats and attacks against government supporters, blocking of streets and major highways. And the blame for all of this is deflected onto the police and government supporters. And this message is then repeated by Washington and, as we've heard, echoed by the mainstream media. And here are some examples. Here are two people lying in the street, evidently shot. They were both subsequently filmed being perfectly okay. And this is the kind of false flag operation that took place in Nicaragua too. And they were publicized as deaths caused by government forces. Even more exaggerated images came out. This was one taken from a Netflix film where opposition supporters were allegedly being tortured by the government. And old images were raked up so that there was no distinction between images that had been taken years ago and images that had come from those days after the election themselves. In Nicaragua, something very similar happened. The violence in Nicaragua began on April the 18th, 2018. There were no deaths that day, but already social media were announcing deaths. So there were false deaths being announced, just the same way as happened in Venezuela. There were particular details about these deaths. So in Venezuela, you had tweets like the one on the left-hand side saying there'd been 3 deaths already when no deaths had actually occurred. On the right in Nicaragua, you have an image of a guy who supposedly was killed by the police that had actually died from normal causes 2 weeks earlier. And these deaths in Nicaragua have been continuously celebrated since then. So the local mainstream media, La Prensa, had a sort of celebratory or commemorative edition 3 years later, in which it showed pictures of people killed in April 2018. And some of these pictures are actually of people who weren't killed at all in 2018, that may even be still alive or died from different causes. And then we had the use of images from elsewhere. So one of the most notorious incidents in Nicaragua in that period of 3 months after April 2018 was the attack on the police station in Morito, in which the actual casualties were 4 police officers and a teacher who were killed by violent opposition, supposedly protesters, and 9 police officers were kidnapped. But the first images to appear were of apparent deaths of protesters. In fact, this image came from the coup attempt, or the successful coup in Honduras in 2009. The image had nothing at all to do with Nicaragua, but it was published in what was then a local newspaper, El Nuevo Diario, and repeated elsewhere. We had perhaps the most famous incident in Nicaragua's case during that period was the false fire incident at the University, when a young girl called Dania Valeska made a video appealing to her parents to forgive her because she expected to be imminently shot. And this video went viral, was tweeted over 1 million times. And yet subsequently videos appeared of other people standing around her in perfect safety while she was making this video supposedly under fire. And in Nicaragua's case, and even more so in the case of Venezuela, as we heard from both Francisco and Camila, these reports were amplified by the use of bots, by huge social media operations, which repeated these violent stories over and over and over again, so that it was impossible to ignore them. And then, of course, we have the role of Elon Musk, who pitched into the Venezuelan election on the side of the opposition and tweeted enormously on what was happening in Venezuela. Many of his tweets were lies, and he was even allegedly castigated by Twitter, or by X itself, for some of his fake tweets. In Nicaragua, as happened in Venezuela, and has been mentioned by Francisco and Camila, there were attacks on local media. And there were also fake attacks. So here in Nicaragua, we had the local media operation 100% Noticias, which is often called 100% Mentiras, 100% lies, where the director, Miguel Mora, said it was under attack. This led to the protesters attacking, in reality, another radio station, Sandinista radio station, Radio Ya, which was set on fire, and 30 people nearly burned to death. And Maria Corina Machado faked an attack on opposition offices in Caracas immediately after the election in a similar way. We had targeted attacks on public services. So a health ministry vehicle destroyed in Masaya, shown in that photograph on the left. There were many, many attacks on health centers and hospitals and so on in Nicaragua. Equally on the right, although they were more limited because they were concentrated in that 24-hour period when the violence occurred, there were attacks on health facilities such as this hospital in COHA. And of course, the government party offices were attacked. And here's a scene on the left from Venezuela. On the right, many, if not most, of the Sandinista offices in Nicaragua were destroyed in that 3-month period in 2018. And any symbols of the revolution were also attacked. So in Masaya, we had these Árboles de la Vida, which are in the main streets in Managua, which are seen as symbols of the revolution. In Venezuela, you have the statues of Hugo Chavez, which were attacked by rioters there. And not surprisingly, when you pay people to cause damage in the way that Francisco described, incidentally, it's much cheaper to hire rioters in Nicaragua, Francisco. The price in Nicaragua was about $15 to $20 per night, rather than the $40 to $150 that I think you mentioned in Caracas. But here we have a scene, it's 2 clips from a video, where these paid rioters wreck a stall, a small stall by the side of the road in Caracas. And a young woman who was taking part in the riots suddenly realizes that her own business is being attacked and bursts into tears. So, you know, when violence occurs, it often becomes completely indiscriminate, and you're hiring people who are used to violence and will just take it out on whatever they see fit. In both Venezuela and in Nicaragua, violent groups were prepared beforehand, and weapons were obviously available before any violence began. We saw evidence of that in Venezuela too. And then when I saw this image on the left of violent groups collecting in a forest somewhere in Venezuela, it reminded me immediately of the image on the right, which is of violent groups collecting in a forest in 2018 in Nicaragua. So we have these, again, very similar incidents occurring with weapons coming from outside, one assumes, at least paid for by foreign funds. And we also had the incidents of protesters and the opposition demanding the intervention of the US. In this case, in Venezuela's case, asking for the US Southern Command to intervene militarily in Venezuela. And similar calls were made in 2018 for surgical strikes against Daniel Ortega in the way that Manuel Noriega was taken away in 1918, the then leader of Panama, which incidentally caused up to 2,000 deaths amongst Panamanians. And I just wanted to conclude with a couple of slides about the media treatment of this whole episode. Here we have La Prensa, the Nicaraguan media now based in Costa Rica, saying that Maduro had detained 2,000 protesters, the implication being that they're peaceful protesters, and they of course become political prisoners once they become arrested. And then coming from the UK, I'm particularly sad to see the BBC's treatment of what happened in Venezuela, but I'm not surprised by it. And this is an analysis, I think it's by Alan MacLeod, of some of the headlines in a BBC story. So the BBC that said that choreographed celebrations in Venezuela took place as Maduro claims he won. And the language is obviously particularly important. He goes on in the story to talk about Nicolas Maduro controlling the electoral authorities, that the pro-government protests are happening in a carefully curated way. The opposition claimed instantly that they, not the president, had won. And Nicolas Maduro does have some loyal supporters still, as if there were very few of those. And of course, they didn't use these images of the massive pro-government rallies that were taking place in Caracas just before the elections. And perhaps the BBC reached the crown of its achievements when it described Maria Corina Machado as the woman who revived hope in Venezuela. And I think that's perhaps a fitting comment on which to end, because it reflects points that Francisco himself was making. Thanks, Becca.
Thank you so much, John. It's so important to see how these media stories are choreographed themselves to be able to bring us this fake news. Now we'd like to turn to Stephen Sefton. Stephen has been a community worker in Nicaragua for 28 years, and since 2008, he's been coordinator of the website Tortilla con Sal, following events in Nicaragua and the region. Since 2003, Stephen's articles have appeared online in outlets in English and Spanish. Stephen, do the patterns of these recent attacks in Venezuela and their targets seem familiar to you after having lived through the attempted coup in Nicaragua in 2018?
Thank you very much, Becca. I think much of what I have to say will complement what John has just said. Let me see if I can share my screen so I can cover the points that I want to make as efficiently as I can. Let's see if I can get that on the full screen. So yeah, I think this 2024 coup attempt in Venezuela does have many similarities with Nicaragua in 2018. But I think it's also worth pointing out, as both Camila and Francisco said earlier, that really Venezuela has been suffering attempts at destabilization and subversion of its government for over 20 years, certainly since 2002, and more intensely following the tragic death of Comandante Eterno Hugo Chavez and the electoral victory in 2013 of Nicolas Maduro. And I think the United States saw its chance to try and intensify its attacks against the Bolivarian Revolution. And they've been continuing ever since then. And they caught up with Nicaragua in 2018. So in 2018, as John pointed out, one of the main similarities between what happened in Nicaragua then and Venezuela just recently has been the social media kind of blitzkrieg, exploiting the confusion in Nicaragua's case over the social security reform as a pretext for what quickly turned into a coup attempt. And in Venezuela, as Francisco's explained to us, they were able to exploit the confusion generated by the attack on the Electoral Council's ability to successfully transmit the results. Together with that, as other people have pointed out, again, there's been this intense international media psychological warfare, and I think we have to give up talking about international media outlets as bona fide news outlets. They gave up being bona fide news outlets many years ago, and I think we should start referring to them as psychological warfare outlets, because that's what they are. And so again, as John has pointed out, the similarities between in Venezuela and Nicaragua, the extremely violent attacks against public service infrastructure, for example, ambulances and hospitals in Nicaragua and Venezuela, the attacks in Granada and Esteli and elsewhere on public town halls, which actually they burned down the town hall in Granada, historic. And also, for example, the attack against the historic university building in Leon, in which a young Sandinista student was burned to death. And so all of this, the psychological warfare, the media blitzkrieg, the violent attacks are designed to terrorize the general population and create a climate of fear in which the opposition are able to impose their agenda, their political agenda. And also, as John pointed out, this effort at terrorization includes violent attacks on both local party activists and on pro-government media, especially in Nicaragua, the radio stations. I think there were a total of 3 radio stations that were burnt down, including Radio Sandino and Nueva Radio Ya. And of course, in Nueva Radio Ya, as John pointed out, 30 radio workers were still in the building when it was set on fire. So another similarity, ultimately, as Camila and Francisco pointed out, has been the triumph of the unity between the civic authorities, the army and the police. With some differences, perhaps, because the army in Nicaragua was not deployed to try and address the violence. They were deployed to protect essential infrastructure like electricity substations, water pumping stations, and so on. Whereas in Venezuela, the army took an active role in confronting the extremely violent attacks by opposition golpista protesters. And some differences. And in Nicaragua, the role of the Catholic Church was absolutely key because it was the only social force that was able, apart from the FSLN, which has ever had the capacity to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. And they did that in what were genuinely peaceful demonstrations. For example, here in Esteli, there was a very large demonstration on the Friday, the 20th of April, but that was infiltrated by extremely violent, what you might call shock troops. And that was a pattern that was repeated throughout Nicaragua. Peaceful demonstrations, largely consisting of people mobilized by the Catholic Church, that were then infiltrated by violent golpista shock elements. And that was especially important on the big march, for example, on Mother's Day. There were 2 rival marches on Mother's Day on May 30th, 2018. And the political role of the Catholic Church was to confuse both the general population and the government, because the government initially invited the Catholic Church to broker a national dialogue. So both the government and the general population initially wrongly assumed that the Catholic Church would act in good faith. And that's, I think it's important to understand that, because the United States, when they're working out their plan of attack in these coup attempts, they're very, very careful about mobilizing the different social elements in a given society that they think will be the most effective. And they were very clever in mobilizing the Catholic Church in Nicaragua in 2018, though ultimately without success. And in Venezuela, luckily, the authorities didn't have to act with that constraint. So then another difference is that in 2018 in Nicaragua, many public servants betrayed the government. For example, very high profile cases like the Supreme Court Judge Rafael Solis, and well, I've forgotten her name now, but a very high level functionary in the central bank. They were very high profile people who denounced the government. And that happened at various levels throughout the government, the central government and local government personnel. And this betrayal by these people could, again, serve to create confusion and doubt among the population. And by contrast, in Venezuela, Venezuelan authorities had already purged traitors, high-level traitors like the former Attorney General Luis Ortega and high-level officials in the PDVSA oil company, for example. And that, again, gave the government there in Venezuela a bit more leeway than they might otherwise have had in pushing forward and making successful the action of the union of civic, military, and police forces in defense of the revolutionary government. And so the end results in both cases, it seems, certainly at the moment in Venezuela and definitely in Nicaragua. The end results have been widespread national rejection of the main right-wing opposition forces, respectively, in Nicaragua and Venezuela, because most people want peace and security and development. And that those things, those objectives, are only going to be delivered very clearly in Nicaragua by the FSLN and in Venezuela by the PSUV, as we've seen by the incredibly successful efforts of Nicolas Maduro and his team to overcome the illegal unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela over the last few years. And there's also the confirmation, these results in Venezuela confirm an electoral reality that prevails both in Venezuela and in Nicaragua. Because, for example, I'd argue strongly, perhaps Francisco may be able to correct me if I've got this wrong, but it seems to me that certainly in Nicaragua, around 40 to 45% of the population solidly support the FSLN, and that seems like a similar number of people in the population in Venezuela supporting the PSUV, whereas the opposition have support, let's be kind and give it to them, between 25 and 30% supporting opposition parties, and that leaves 25 to 30% of voters acting as independents. And both in Nicaragua and in Venezuela, it seems to me, most of the independents tend to support the policies of the FSLN government in Nicaragua and the PSUV government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, because they very clearly benefit the impoverished majority of which those independents mostly are a part. And this has been the electoral pattern in Venezuela and Nicaragua since 2011. And certainly it seems to me it's been the electoral pattern in Venezuela too since 2013. Now, the United States and the European Union are impotent against that electoral reality. And that's why they sought to change it in Venezuela, certainly since at least 2013, because they know the opposition can't win elections in a free and fair way. And that's certainly been the case here in Nicaragua. And one of the things that I think Venezuela, certainly in Nicaragua, and the measures taken by the government subsequent to 2018, various bits of legislation that were implemented by the Nicaraguan government, prevented what happened in Venezuela now in 2024 happening to us here in 2021, because they were able to arrest the people that were trying to destabilize and subvert the electoral process in 2021. And those people ended up being stuck on a plane and sent back to where they belong in the United States. Perhaps Venezuela will do the same. Anyway, and that's my summary of how things look from my point of view, and I hope that's been useful to people.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We appreciate your comments and putting all of this into context. Now we have a few minutes for question and answers. So we'll go to some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A section. First of all, for Francisco, there's a question in particular about the Venezuelan elections. Do they use a large groups of volunteers to help with the elections? Because there were lines, it seems like took a while for people to vote with that process. Do they have, like in Nicaragua, the same system where they use a lot of volunteers to help move voters through? And perhaps you can just describe if the role of the watchers or the accompaniers who came internationally, if they're not doing the observing, then what is the role that they play?
Yeah, if that's okay, I think I'll give some more details of the system as well as the observer, because the media is so insidious that we need to really go through details of this. The role of the observers or veedores or watchers or accompagners, there are several categories, and we have different protocols. And that's quite important. For example, the accompagners can make political statements, when they meet, when they go around the place. And if they want to see polling stations, they can. Whereas people like myself, a veedor, we couldn't make any statement. We were totally impartial in that sense, whatever we had in our head. The system is organized in such a way that somebody comes in with an identity card the number is typed into a special machine, and then after it's typed in the special machine, the photograph of the person comes up in the machine itself. That confirms that the person is the person. But then there is the capta huella, which is the fingerprint machine, where the person has to put the fingerprint, the thumb, and then that confirms that the person is the person. And then that activates the voting machine. The person goes to behind the sort of very simple thing covered. The person makes a choice with the finger. It's a touch screen. And then the screen produces their preference, and then they ask them to confirm that that is their option. When they say yes, the vote goes in electronically, and then a receipt is produced by the machine, which is getting by the voter, and they confirm in a printed version that they voted for what they really voted. Then this goes into a box. The person continues to go to another couple of officers that actually have a list, which is in paper, and they find the name of the person on the basis of their identity card. They have to sign that and have to put the fingerprint on that. That is the end of it. That is to say, it is impossible, literally impossible, to substitute somebody. That's number one. So we observe the process, we ask the people and so on. Number two, all the parties are entitled to have witnesses present in every single voting place, absolutely all of them. And there were over 30,000 of them. At the end of the process, at 6 o'clock or round about there, if there is nobody in the queue, then the machine electronically produces the result. This is tallied with what is in the box. Once that is the case, then everybody, including the witnesses, signed an acta, which is the document that has a QR. So the confirmation of that goes electronically into the National Electoral Council, and a copy of that with the QR is given to every single party representative, who they send this to their own centers of totalization. So if every single body has every single acta, I don't know how many there are, but it's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And nobody knows exactly what is going to happen at the end, because it is one single place, and every single place has something like 400 to 900 to 1,200 persons who actually vote. And not everybody votes in that election. So it is literally impossible. So my point, the first point I want to make is this. If Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez claim they had 100% of the actors, there is no reason why they couldn't submit them, and they're hiding. And it's totally clear that they don't. Because if you won by that margin, which is nearly 40% on top of what Maduro is supposed to have got, then there is no reason for that 29 to sort of hide away, to play games, to play cat and mouse, saying they're not there and so on. What you would do is to actually produce the evidence. The New York Times will produce it, the BBC, the US government, and everybody else, and we haven't got a single real actor from the position that confirms anything. So that's important. In other words, the system is completely impeccable. It's totally impeccable. Before the election, there are at least 15 audits. And the system is such that you cannot move to audit number 1 to audit number 2 until audit number 1 is satisfied, everybody's satisfied with. Then you move to number 2. And in every single audit, everybody participates. All the political parties that are involved, including independents, technicians, international personalities, experts, and so on, participate in this. So you get to the election only after 15, and the final audit is the one that I'm telling you about, which is they tally what the machine, the electronic machine, produced with the box of the vote, of the ballot box. So our job is totally simple. We go there, we check that everything is going okay. I remember, shaking hands with members of the PSUV, with members of the opposition, with members of Maria Corina Machado party, saying, well, it's great that you're doing this job. Thank you very much for allowing us to be here, and so on. So that's number one. It is very important to understand this. When they say in the media that Maduro and company and the government and the CNE are not prepared to submit the document, this is totally false. It's completely false. It's not true. You can't really, it's fraud proof, the whole system. So that's number one. Can I answer some of the questions? Shall I leave it here?
Leave it there for now, and we'll see.
Yeah. If there is anything that people need to clarify regarding the election itself, I'm quite happy to come back. So I leave it there for the time.
That's fine. There is another question in the Q&A about who has allegedly paid the rioters. I don't know if Camila knows the answer to that, or if Francisco can speak to that. Who is actually paying the folks who are out creating the violence? Go ahead, Francisco, if you can.
Yeah. In 2014, it was clear, and the reason why we know this is this. When somebody who is participating in riots, normally very young people, usually people with some criminal record of different kinds, because they go for that. They are interrogated, they're arrested, they're interrogated. A drug test is actually conducted on them to know whether they've been on the drugs. So every single one of them has this test that is conducted on them. And that's what we know, that on this occasion and previous occasion, in 2014 and 2017, they used Captagon. And they themselves, and there are plenty of videos all over the place, where they say, I was offered $20, $40, $150, $100 and so to do this. And the complication, and they themselves explain after they've been arrested and they calm down after the effect of the went away, they said that they have to actually take a picture of themselves doing this stuff, or else they are not paid. And the money comes from the money stolen to Venezuela in the United States, which is disgusting. So that's the problem. So they have millions and millions and millions of dollars to do whatever they want. And that is what, and there is a sort of pattern that took place in 2014 and 2017. In the first case, it lasted about 3 months, and in the second case, it lasted about 6 months. I think they were prepared for something longer this time, but the robust response from the government was sufficient for them not to continue.
Thank you, Francisco. John?
I just wanted to add that the experience in Nicaragua is very similar. Here, Dora Maria Tellez, who was an ex-Sandinista who now supports the opposition, was seen in Masaya by several different people distributing money to people at the roadblocks. And not only did they distribute money, but they distributed marijuana, rum, and of course weapons and bullets and so on, and food. And this was taking place on a daily basis, and the money was being stored in local Catholic churches.
Thank you, John. Stephen?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in my remarks about the Catholic Church, and that was one of the key roles of the Catholic Church. And there are local barricades here on the Pan American Highway were operated by local thugs who received payment directly from priests and nuns who were funded by the
He's
I think
frozen.
we're losing Stephen. We're losing Stephen's internet. At this point, we just want to give one final question to all of our panelists, and we'll go around and everyone will get a chance to answer briefly. The question is, how do you regard the success with which Venezuela and Nicaragua have defended their sovereignty and defeated repeated U.S. interventions? And there's one other question that hasn't been answered, which has to do with the position of the Catholic Church hierarchy in Venezuela. If anyone can speak to that at the same time, that would be wonderful. So we'll start with you, Francisco, brief response, and then we'll go around.
Can you repeat the first question? I didn't get that.
Sure. It is, how do you regard the success with which Venezuela and Nicaragua have been able to defend their sovereignty and against repeated interventions from the U.S.?
Well, I think it's extraordinary. I think the response of the FSLN and the Sandinista people has been very robust. So robust that actually Sometimes it creates problems in solidarity work because the people over here think it's too robust. But I think it's exactly the right thing to do, because a little country which is so small, but is so proud and is so fantastic that it's sort of changed, the perception of Latin America, certainly in 1979, and it's been brutalized, waged war against, 50,000, 80,000 people have been assassinated, and so on and so forth. They deserve to defend themselves with everything they have. So, I take my hat off of the Sandinista people of the Venezuela, of the Nicaraguan people for their ability to defend themselves. And if you look at, I don't have the time, I'll just give the headline. If you look at the economic successes of such a poor country in terms of being able to cater for their own population, it's just incredibly amazing. It's even, as we say in London, it's even better, much, much better. So it's fantastic in every possible sense. Now, in terms of Venezuela, I think it's sort of perhaps interesting in the following sense. The amount of sanctions that were inflicted on Venezuela has been 930. It's huge. I mean, there was a moment when a country which depended almost totally from the oil revenues lost 99% of that. That is to say, there was one point in 2015-14 when they were receiving, say, the equivalent of $100, and then 2 years later they were receiving $1. And they were able to survive, not only to survive, not only to improve the self-sufficiency, not only to defeat imperialism, but also recover the economy. And the economy last month, the rate of inflation in June was 1%. And this year, the economy of Venezuela is down to grow by something between 5 to 8%. To be able to recover that much, and then under those conditions, even though there's been a significant economic recovery, still is possible for the Chavistas, to defeat imperialism, to defeat the coup d'etat, is an indication of their quality as political leadership, which I think it matters. So that's one aspect. And in terms of the success of US imperialism, I think it still is successful to some degree because we are disunited in Latin America. We need regional integration fast. The sooner the better, because the more together we are, as there was one moment during the first pink tide. No, it was not perfect, but it was much better. If we are together, then it's much more difficult for the United States to actually go for us. Now we have what is called the Troika, which is Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, identified as the best ones at the vanguard. Therefore, they are in the front line and they receive the worst possible blows. When it comes, as a small footnote regarding Venezuela, when it comes to the Catholic Church, let me summarize in one point. It's totally reactionary and has supported every single possibility, every single plan, and every single effort to destabilize, to overthrow the government, and it's failed miserably every occasion. The population at large in Venezuela is very, very Catholic. But when it comes to their relationship with the Catholic Church, it's very tenuous. People are very ferociously independent, even though they're Catholic. Chavez was a Catholic. Maduro says a Catholic. So that's not the issue. And I think the Catholic Church used to have in 2002 some significant weight. It doesn't have that anymore. And now it plays second fiddle at best, and it's much more careful than it used to be. But we will continue fighting, and I think we'll continue to win, provided that, these very capable, impressive political leadership, such as the FSLN, such as the Cuban Communist Party, and such as the PSUV, continue to be in the leadership of this country. Long live them. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. John?
Yes, well, I agree with everything Francisco said. I think those of us who live in Nicaragua, and several of the people whose names are on the screen live in Nicaragua, are absolutely amazed and grateful that we managed to resist US imperialism in the way that we have. And there are special factors, I think, that apply in our case. The sanctions have been nowhere near as strong as they have on Venezuela or Cuba. We're self-sufficient in food. We're a small country. The police and army were radicalized by the revolution in 1979. And so I think the achievements in Venezuela of defeating US imperialism in the election in many ways are much greater and let's hope that they endure. And I think that everybody in Nicaragua, everybody who's politically engaged in Nicaragua, and that's quite a large proportion of the population, were watching what was happening on July the 28th very carefully, because what happens in Venezuela is extremely important for the rest of Latin America, and we will continue to support Venezuela.
Thank you, John. Camila, are you with us? Can you answer the question?
Yeah, I am here. I am doing my admin because I've been traveling. But with regards to how I regard the success of Venezuela and Nicaragua, I think that's already been answered. But I want to say that anyone who's serious about the defense of our sovereign and independent models here in the global South and Latin America, specifically in Venezuela and Nicaragua, has to also defend our right to carry out and implement our own justice system, our own laws, the way in which we conduct ourselves in our countries. It's not really up for the exterior or the international left or anyone else to determine how we conduct human rights or how we protect the people of these countries from terrorism and these Borimba crimes that we're seeing. Most governments around the world would naturally agree that the acts committed by these people in question that we've been talking about, the leaders of the far-right opposition in Venezuela, that they are actually acts of treason. Years ago, we're talking about people who committed acts of treason in violation of foreign agents laws for the last 15 to 20 years, not just during this presidential campaign and not just during the acts of violence and terrorism we saw in the 2 days following the election. Those crimes are punishable anywhere, and they would certainly be punished in the countries of the United States, of Europe, and Canada, and China, Iran, Russia, and everywhere else. So there's no reason why Venezuela and Nicaragua shouldn't be allowed to, and of course we have to include Cuba, to go and arrest the people who are perpetrating these crimes or who are the masterminds or who are financing them in their countries immediately and hold them accountable to ensure that no one else gets harmed. That is always in question by the human rights industries and all of the different writers and so-called human rights activists on the exterior, primarily based in places like Washington and Brussels. I certainly defend the right of these governments to do what they need to do to put an end to the violence, to maintain stability and control over the situation in the country. And we know that that will require the deployment of the security forces, both the police, in the case of Venezuela, the National Bolivarian Guard, and to carry out those arrests. And even in the face of this huge and heavy propaganda campaign in the mainstream international media, we know that it's absolutely necessary to make sure that the violence and instability comes to a quick end.
Thank you, Camila. Stephen?
Yeah, my take is I look at it more perhaps from a geopolitical point of view, and I agree absolutely with everything that Francisco and John and Camila have said in terms of the national reality of Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba too, and the fact that they've been able to triumph over the Monroe doctrine and force the United States into a position where they're obviously absolutely desperate, is very, very important. And I think that's a tremendous example and a great encouragement. And I think that the position of people like Gustavo Petro, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, to some extent Lula da Silva in their respective countries, is a kind of validation of the tremendous resistance that our revolutionary countries have put up to United States efforts to recover its power. Because as Francisco said, there was a moment earlier, say between 2006 and 2013, when our revolutionary governments had a tremendous influence in the developments, the development, especially for regional integration in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that the people like Andrés Manuel López Obrador Gustavo Petro and Lula are beneficiaries of that resistance. You know, and I think that's worth bearing in mind. And all of that has to do with the fact that the United States simply can't compete internationally with economic rivals like China and military rivals like Russia, and even countries like the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I think that we can be tremendously proud of what Venezuela has achieved over the last week or so in defense of its sovereignty, as Camila said. And that's a tremendous lesson for the other popular movements in Latin America. And I think although things may look not great in terms of the regional perspective at the moment, with so many right-wing governments, fascist governments in Ecuador, in Peru, in Argentina, for example, and fascist-like government in Chile, for example, things might not look great. But I think what Venezuela has done over the last few days, combined with what Cuba has done over the last 60 years, what Nicaragua has been able to do since 2007, are an absolute bulwark preventing the United States from having it all its own way in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing your insights with us today. It's been inspiring to see real examples of how these two countries have thwarted and continue to thwart destabilization attempts organized and financed by the United States. Our hearts are with the victorious people of Venezuela and Nicaragua. Thank you so much, everyone.